perfectly fine. We do have a chat box up that the girls are going to be monitoring for us. So if you do have questions that come up, put them into the chat box. And we are going to kind of start covering some of the basics of Poultry 101. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrea Jeter, and I am the Montezuma County 4-H Program Coordinator in Cortez, Colorado, which is in the very southwest corner of the state. I've been a 4-H Program Coordinator. This is my 6th year that I'm starting on, but I've been a 4-H leader for 22 years, had children in the program for 21 years consecutively, and was also a 10-year 4-H member. So I'm kind of versed in the 4-H world, but poultry is definitely where my heart belongs with the chicken stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, some of you, I was looking through the polls on here and seeing a lot of you look like you've already had some poultry, have some moderate experience with some of these details. And I always think, even if it is basic information, sometimes you can walk away with some sort of a tip or some sort of new knowledge of something that you didn't think or maybe want to try. So if it is a review for you, hopefully you'll still get something out of the whole thing. So let's start out with talking about some common poultry terms. And Marlena, I believe you were going to put that in the chat box, a link to those terms. Not everybody needs to know these right off the top of their head, but these are some terms that if you are needing to know for 4-H, this is a good way to go back and review some of those terms you may not know, or also just to help you with knowing what we're talking about tonight when we're going through some things. So some of the
I'm pulling up the link right now. Give me just a second. Sorry about that.
Awesome. So some of the common poultry terms that you guys are going to be hearing throughout your poultry career, whether it's 4-H or whether you're doing backyard poultry, a pullet, a cockerel, a hen, a cock, a drake, a tom, a gander, a goose, and a duckling, all sorts of different names. These are actually names that different ages of poultry are called, whether they are with chickens or whether they're with your goose, your ganders, going into some of the different poultry species. So just really quickly, a pullet is a female chicken that is under a year of age. A cockerel is a male chicken under a year of age. A hen and a cock are what we refer to as a female or a male chicken that are over a year of age. So this comes back into play, especially when you start entering for your 4-H fairs or for any of your poultry shows that you may be entering in, because the shows do place your categories based on whether they are over a year or under a year. A drake is a male duck. A tom is a male turkey. They can also be called a jake. A jake is usually a male turkey that is under a year old. A gander is a male goose. A goose, of course, is a female goose. A goose is a goose. And a duckling is a baby duck. A gosling is a baby goose. A poult, a poult is always one that we always have on all of our poultry questions fair, but a poult is a baby turkey. Straight run, this is something new that we're going to talk about when we start talking about hatcheries, but a straight run is a term that we use for unsexed chicks. Also, it can be called hatchery run. If you're purchasing chicks, this comes back to play as being something you want to pay attention to. The APA, which is the American Poultry Association. The ABA, which is the American Bantam Association. The Standard of Perfection is a publication that's put out by either the APA or the ABA that has all of the recognized breeds and varieties and it also uses it as a judging and breed guidelines. A breed, of course, is an established group of individuals that when mated produce the same characteristics. And that's something that you really want to understand, that they are all going to breed to look exactly alike. And then we have a variety, which is a subdivision of a breed. This can be the differences in color. Color usually variety refers to color. It can also be a difference in comb types or presence of muffs or beards. Now, again, I just am going over these different vocabulary words just so that when some of these topics come up later, you can refer back to these to know what we were talking about. So a class is a grouping of breeds with similarities. Bantam is a small breed, usually a quarter of the size of a large breed. And a standard is a large or normal size of a breed. So let's talk about what you need for your birds. If you are brand new to poultry and have never done anything with birds before, this is what you're going to want to pay attention to. So basically, the equipment that you're going to need for your poultry project is going to depend on what your project goals are. Are you getting chicks? Are you getting adult birds to start with? What type of a project are you planning on doing? Are you going to do egg production? Are you going to be showing birds? Are they more for pets? Or are you doing a market project with your animals? And then, of course, depending on what you're doing, you may need some show equipment. One of the first things to think about when you are picking out your birds is what type of housing requirements you're going to need. So the type and size of birds is going to tell you how much room they need. Large fowl, those big standard birds like your Buff Orpingtons, your Rhode Island Reds, even your market birds. In technicality, they need an average of 3 to 4 square feet if they're housed with other birds. Bantam breeds, 2 to 3 square feet per bird, again, if they're housed with other birds. But I want you to think about what 3 square feet is. So if anybody looks at their tiles on their floors, if they have those little squares, a lot of times those are a foot. They're 12 inches by 12 inches. So 3 to 4 square feet would be 3 or 4 of those. That's the space that those birds would be living in. So it's not a whole heck of a lot of room. If you look at the picture that's on the screen with these show pens in here, a lot of these show pens are averaging out about that 2 to 3 square feet. So it's not a whole lot of room that they need. But remember, you definitely want to be able to give your birds room to move around. Another consideration that you want to take in when you're deciding what kind of housing you're going to provide for your birds is, where do you live? The picture there on the left, if that's your backyard, you may be having a little bit different types of predators than you could if you're living in the picture on the right and maybe living in town with a nice backyard. So you definitely want to think about, where do I live? What are the conditions that my birds are going to be living in? If you live in the Rocky Mountain regions, I know we've got some people on that may not be from Colorado tonight. If you're living where we are, we have snow, we have cold, we have wind. You may need to be concerned about what kind of weather conditions. If you're in the South, maybe you're dealing more with humidity and you're dealing with heat. One of the biggest things you need to think about is everything wants to kill your chickens. Everything. It doesn't matter whether it is raccoons, whether it's cats, whether it's bears. Even crows and ravens are known to come into pens and to eat the baby chicks, carry off your market birds, your turkey babies, everything. Everything wants to kill chickens. The worst for killing chickens is the friendly neighborhood dog. So again, when you're thinking about where you're going to have your birds, what kind of housing you're going to keep your birds in, you definitely want to make sure that you're paying attention to what kind of predators that you have around, including your own pets. And of course, we like to kill our chickens if we're doing them for meat birds, right? So everything wants to kill your chickens. Chickens are literally on the very bottom of the food list when it comes to things. But if you're raising a market pen, there's nothing worse than having those other predators that we talked about a minute ago coming in and getting them before you can get them to this stage where we actually get to enjoy the fruits of our labors there. So here's some examples of some readily available small chicken coops. I know we've got, it's really cool in the 4-H world especially, and even if you're not in 4-H, a lot of our urban settings, a lot of our cities and towns are actually allowing those backyard birds right now. And it's very nice to be able to purchase one of these type of coops very inexpensively from one of your local feed stores. And these work really, really well. A setup like this one up here in the top right-hand corner, you could easily keep 6 to 8 hens in there, which is what most of our cities will allow to have in your backyard. These pens are usually fairly inexpensive, $200-300 at your local feed stores. And they've got some fairly good wire on them. We're going to talk about this wire here in a few minutes, but they've got some fairly thick wire on them that's going to help prevent some of those predators from being able to get in there and get to your birds. If you're on a larger scale, maybe you need a barn that has all sorts of different room in there. This happens to be my own personal barn, my poultry barn. It is getting some wire up here on top just because of the biosecurity needs that we have going on right now. But you can go anything from having something nice and little that you have 3 or 4 up to 6 hens in. I currently have over 100 birds in this barn, so it just depends on what you're doing with your birds. The biggest thing when you are picking out housing for your animals, for your birds, whether they be chickens, whether they be turkeys, whether they be pheasants, whether they be ducks, please, please, please keep in mind that chicken wire is designed to keep chickens in. It will not keep predators out. Even your friendly little house dog can go out there and chew through this wire quite easily. This is a very light gauge wire, and it will get torn up pretty quick and easy. It's great to, put over the top of a pen to help keep your birds in if you're having flying out problems, but it is definitely not going to keep those predators out that we were just talking about. Welded wire, a good heavy gauge welded wire, or even using a chain link fence around the outside of your pens is definitely recommended to help keep any of those predators out. This is going to just, that extra work that it takes to put this up is going to pay for itself by not having to worry about those dogs or coyotes or raccoons or skunks getting into your pens. So I definitely recommend, no matter what you're doing with your housing setup, make sure you've got some good heavy gauge wire protecting your birds. So I know one of the questions that we had on our poll is, what kind of birds do you need? What breeds do you want to have? So again, what do you want to do? There are tons and tons of different types of poultry out there. There are over 100 breeds that are recognized by the American Poultry Association. There are tons of different ducks. There are tons of turkeys out there. What do you want to do? Especially if you're in 4-H, your project is up to you. What your desire is, what your outcome from your project is what we want you to pick your birds from. So whether it be egg production, whether you want to raise baby chicks, whether you're looking for cute little bantams that you want to have as pets, or whether you're looking for these big meat birds, what you want to do is going to depend on your housing, and it's also going to depend on what breed you actually want to purchase. I always love to throw this one in here because this is how we all start. Oh, I'm only just going to get like 6 or 7 birds, and I don't count mine anymore because then I have to admit that I've got a problem with how many birds I have. So I'm just warning you that chickens can be addictive. This will be you in a year. So where are you going to get your birds for your projects? So there are hatcheries out there, commercial hatcheries, that do hatch birds by the hundreds or even thousands on a weekly or even bi-weekly basis. Most of these hatcheries ship their chicks out via the U.S. Postal Service, and they actually ship them right into your own local post office. They'll give you a call. They'll tell you that your chicks are in. Everybody will go running down to the post office first thing in the morning to get all their cute little chicks in. You can also go to your local feed store. Right now, I know I saw the sign coming into work this morning that said that our local IFA had their chicks in. So I can't wait to go see all the babies. No matter what your local supply for your feed stores are, they all normally have those chicks in the springtime. Most of these chicks have come from those reputable hatcheries like we were just showing in the prior picture, whether that be Murray McMurray, whether it be Privet, whether it be Cackle. There's tons of big hatcheries out there that contract with these different suppliers for your chicks. The sound of spring, we all know it. You walk into one of those feed stores and you hear all those little babies back there. It's hard to walk away without them. One of the nice things about hatcheries and looking at your feed stores is a lot of them will have these hatchery descriptions up. I will warn you, though, one of my pet peeves about some of these hatchery descriptions is they don't necessarily tend to be written towards the American Poultry Breeders Association standards. They tend to be kind of written in layman terms. This one's showing some pictures of some barred, what they're calling barred Plymouth rocks. The barred is actually the variety. The Plymouth rock is actually the breed. So when you start getting into your poultry projects, these are some of the things, especially when you go into showmanship, that they're going to be asking you about is what is the difference between your breeds and what's the difference in the varieties? Plymouth Rocks, for example, come in all sorts of different varieties. There's barred, there's white, there's buff, there's penciled, there's partridge. There's all this variety out there of different colors. So beware. It's like when they have the buff Orpington up there. Orpington is actually the breed. Buff is actually the color. But they all will have some sort of tag up on their cages usually that kind of tell you about the different breeds. I really encourage everybody before you pick what breed you're doing to really think about what is it that you want to do, just like we were talking about. What is the goal of your project? And then once you pick that goal, then start picking a breed that actually goes along with your goal. As you can see down here, it talks about these are excellent dual purpose birds. Dual purpose means that they're used for both eggs and meat, meaning that they have a large enough adult weight that they could be used for that individual market type bird. And they're excellent for backyard production due to their docile nature. This is where they're talking about that egg production. So if you're looking for something that you can use for both eggs and meat, you're looking for those multi-purpose birds. Here's one of those great birds for you. So reading those different hatchery descriptions, getting into your standard of perfection and actually looking at those different types of birds will give you a better idea of what kind of bird you want to get for your project. So if you've chosen to look for breeders instead of going to a hatchery, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences in them in just a second, here's some of the different places that you can look for actual breeders. There are local poultry associations and clubs. I know there's the Rocky Mountain Feather Fanciers Association in Colorado. Most states have some sort of poultry club or association. There's also breed clubs out there. So if you find that you really like an Orpington, maybe looking at the Orpington Breeders of America would be a good idea. There's also the American Poultry Association and the American Bantam Breeders Association, the APA and the ABA, that both also have publications or yearbooks that they put out that have all sorts of breeders listed in them. And then there's also print materials like Poultry Press and Backyard Poultry that also list different types of breeders or for sale ads. And there's also, and I will definitely key in on the reliable social media sites. There are definitely some really good reliable sites out there, Show Poultry Central, things like that, that are really good sites. Beware, there are some social media sites out there that don't necessarily give the great stuff, great information. If it seems too good to be true, if they're throwing some stuff up that you just don't feel right about, probably not the site to go off of. We all know that most Facebook sites do not allow the sale of animals. So if they're throwing out all sorts of animals for sale, probably not who you want to go to. Please be aware of there are scammers out there. So let's talk a little bit about hatchery versus exhibition stock. So here's some pictures that are kind of comparing some individual hatchery versus exhibition. Exhibition, we also talk about, those are the ones that you're getting from a breeder. That's somebody that's been breeding the animals for show versus hatchery, where you're going to an individual hatchery or you're going to your feed stores. The biggest thing to keep in mind is hatcheries are breeding for quantity over quality. They're breeding to have lots and lots and lots of birds, lots of eggs that are being hatched on a weekly basis to go out to serve all those different Murdochs, all those different Tractor Supplies, all those IFAs or whatever your local feed stores are. So they're cranking them out. They're not necessarily calling for those individual traits like what breeders do. If you are raising your birds for, backyard enjoyment, you're getting them for eggs, you just want to have some good old birds that you can show at your local fair. You are perfectly good with going out and getting some hatchery stock at the local IFA or your local feed store. The issue there is showing those birds at any type of a large fair or a large poultry show. They just do not have the quality that those birds do that come from exhibition stock. If you look at the same picture here, I have this picture from Privet with the barred rocks right here compared to some breeder quality birds. These are actually some of my own barred rocks that I have, Plymouth Rocks. Down here, these are standard bred Rhode Island Reds. You can tell there's a huge difference in the color between these different birds. Standard bred Rhode Island Reds, they're also being called heritage Rhode Island Reds right now. They're a really, really dark color. These birds are also about twice the size of what you would get from a feed store quality bird. The little call ducks up here, some of you guys may have seen the call ducks. Call ducks are little bantam ducks. They're little tiny guys that everybody likes. There's a huge difference between the show bird and the regular pet quality. Same thing with these silkies down here. Everybody likes to get the silkies at the feed store because they're the fluffy, pretty ones with all the cool little feathered feet on them. Again, we just want you to be aware. Now, I'm not saying you cannot go out and get hatchery birds for your 4-H project, because hatchery birds are wonderful for laying eggs. They usually lay better than some of our exhibition stock does. They're usually easier to get because sometimes trying to get some of these exhibition birds is difficult because you're having to pay for shipping. You're having to travel to wherever those breeders are. So I'm not saying you cannot use hatchery birds. Hatchery birds definitely have their place, but please be aware that if you are trying to show them against somebody that has exhibition stock at their fair or at a poultry show, your hatchery stock is just not going to be able to compete against them. So at this point, hopefully you have figured out what kind of bird that you want. You have got all the stuff that they told you that you needed. If you were getting chicks, you've got something to put them in. The picture that I have up here, you've got some sort of a container to put your chicks in. You've got a heat source. You've got feeders. You've got waterers, some sort of bedding material, whether that be pine shavings. I like to start my chicks out using like the doggy potty pads or even the human pads that you can put down. They have an absorbent layer in them. And I like to use those for about the first week before I change them over to pine beddings, just because they tend to find their food a little bit better being on some of those pads instead of being on the shavings. Shavings can also be the cause of what's called pasty butt, because the chicks are trying to eat the shavings instead of their actual food. But once you've got those birds home, now what do you do? You've probably had some help with picking out what kind of housing they need for the first few weeks, but now what? So a lot of our kids are starting out with getting those baby chicks. So baby chicks take a little bit of space. They don't take a whole lot of space, but you do need to keep in mind that they are going to grow quickly. So you can see here between that 0 to 4 weeks, we're talking about a half a square foot. Remember those square tiles on your floor? A half of one of those is what each one of those chicks need. But by the time they're about a month old, that's going to go up to a square foot. I will tell you that chicks are just like when you are dealing with fish in an aquarium. The more room they have to grow, the better off they are going to grow, and they're going to grow faster. So how long are your chicks going to require heat? In week 1, they need to be staying right around 95 degrees. When a chick is in an incubator, that incubator is usually at 99.5 degrees. So that first week, we're lowering it down a little bit. Week 2 to 4, you can start decreasing that heat in 5-degree increments. And over 4 weeks, you can start decreasing that heat and weaning them off of the heat as the weather allows. Now, most of us that live in Colorado know we just went from nice warm days to we hopefully all have snow on the ground now. So this is really going to vary depending on your region. It's going to vary upon what type of weather you have. You need to be around to make sure that those chicks are not getting too cold. If you've turned those heat lamps off during the day, this 4 to 8 week range is usually when they're starting to feather out. They're starting to be able to run around outside without those heat lamps on. But again, you really want to be cognizant of what your weather is doing at that time. But generally, after about 6 to 8 weeks, you're looking at being able to remove them from the heat. One of the biggest debates in the poultry world right now is using heat lamps. There have been a ton of barn fires that have dealt with heat lamps being improperly used, being hung up where they could get knocked down. The dander, the dust gets around the heat lamp, and it actually can explode those heat lamps. And there's been a lot of losses to barns because of these heat lamps. They've come out with something called these heater plates. There's several different brands on the market. You can also get them at one of your local feed stores, or you can order them online, of course. And what it is basically a heat pad that's up here at the top. If you're getting small amounts of chicks, that 5 to 10, these small heat pads work wonderfully. They kind of mimic the mama chick or the mama hen. They kind of cuddle up underneath there and they're keeping themselves warm. These are way safer than using a heat lamp. It's up to you. It's your personal preference on which one you want to use. But if you are using a heat lamp, please, please, please make sure that it is secure and there's no way that sucker can get knocked off of there and swung into something or drop down into the pen. Because a lot of us are using these shavings by the times that our chicks are up and running around good. Heat lamp, shavings equals disaster. So just be very aware of that. If you've got your chicks, this is what you want to study. These are the different types of temperatures and what the behavior of your chicks is going to be with those different temperatures. Up in the top left-hand corner, you can see there's little dots everywhere. Those are your little chicks running around. They're all happy. They're scattered out. This is what they consider just right. This is that comfort zone for your chicks. You want them, no matter where they are in the brooder, whatever your brooder is, whether it's a cardboard box, whether it's a stock tank, whether it's a tub, whatever you're using to keep your baby chicks in is going to be referred to your brooder. As long as they're out running around, everything is good. If they are all huddled up over on one side, obviously there's some sort of a draft coming through there that's pushing them all to one side. If they're all huddled up underneath the heat source, it's too cold. And of course, if they're all scattered around the very outside trying to get away, they're too hot. So learning to watch the behavior of your birds will tell you whether they're little happy birds in there or not. If you hear birds just clucking away and really, really cheeping and everybody seems to be screaming in there, there's probably something wrong. They're either too hot or they're too cold. A lot of these birds, when they're all scattered out, they're nice and quiet. So if your birds are driving you crazy cheeping, go check on them. You need to see why they're cheeping. So when can your chicks be without heat? This is always the question we get a lot, because having those temperatures that fluctuate, when can we take them off of the heat? So your chicks should be fully feathered. This little guy down here is almost reaching that stage of being fully feathered. We talk about fully feathered being when all this downy fluff has been shed or molted out and they've gotten their regular feathers in. That's what we consider fully feathered. What are your daytime temperatures? If your daytime temperatures are up into the later 70s and 80s, it's probably going to be warm enough to take those heat lamps off during the day. Your chicks may be getting too hot if you keep those on. But keep in mind what your nighttime temperatures are. In the spring in Colorado, we can have daytime temperatures of those 70s and 80s, and our nighttime temperatures could still be in the 40s. Those birds are still going to be getting cold. If you see your birds huddling together, they're not fully feathered, they still need to have that heat source on them. Not everybody going to start with chicks. Sometimes it's not something that you want to deal with having those heat lamps and not having to worry about when you can have that heat off of them. If you are bringing home adult birds, you need to keep them quarantined. Quarantine means keeping them away from any of the other birds that you have. And you need to keep them away for a minimum of 30 days. The reason why we do this is for the biosecurity of making sure that none of our birds catch a disease or sickness from the others. I love this quote from Benjamin Franklin: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound in cure." If you prevent things, it is way easier than having to try to find a vet that does chickens. Because I don't know where you guys all live, but trying to find a vet to see your chickens can sometimes be very, very difficult. So we want to make sure that any of our adult birds coming home, if you bought some from Jane down the road and then you bought some from Bill, those two different groups of birds need to be kept quarantined from each other for that 30 days. And when I'm saying kept quarantined and away from each other, we're talking in different barns. We're not just talking in different cages, we're talking in different barns because we don't want them to spread any type of disease they have. After that 30 days, then you can start mixing your flocks. And talk very briefly about some feeding and nutrition. We will be talking a little bit more about diseases and feeding and nutrition in a future webinar. But I want you to think about, for those of you that are just starting out your poultry projects this year, there are some different types of feeds out there that you're going to want to consider. If you're getting chicks, you need to start them out on some sort of a chick starter. If you've got a mixed flock would be something that you've got like chicks and ducks and turkeys all together, maybe considering something called a flock raiser, which is fed to multiple species. And then there's also layer that you might be feeding to your older birds. These are what we call complete feeds. And complete feeds is a term that is used to mean it is everything that your bird needs dietary wise to be able to sustain them. They don't need any extras added into it. Everything that they need is in that one type of food. We definitely recommend using a complete feed because that is going to help give you the best product if you're raising market animals, the best eggs, the best chance of them laying an egg every day. If you're using these complete feeds, if you're growing chicks, that's going to get them off to the best start you possibly can. If you're feeding chicks, there are non-medicated and there's medicated starters. A lot of times this is a personal choice on whether you're feeding a non-medicated or a medicated feed. Medicated feed for chicks, in my opinion, is extremely important because it is going to help prevent what's called coccidiosis, which is a infection, for lack of better terms. We'll talk about that in another webinar series too. But coccidiosis is an infection that the birds can get, and it will very quickly kill your birds. By feeding a medicated feed, it includes a type of antibiotic that is actually going to help prevent your birds from getting sick. If you're feeding a non-medicated feed, you need to take some extra precautions to make sure that your birds aren't getting sick, especially if you're keeping them on dirt. You need to really think about feeding a medicated feed. You do not have to feed a medicated feed for the duration of the time that you have birds. But up until about 16 weeks of age is good to keep them on a regular chick starter. We all talk about scratch. Grandma and Grandpa may talk about feeding scratch, which is usually a corn and a wheat and a Milo mixture. Scratch is cheap, but it is not a complete feed. It does not provide all the nutritional requirements that our birds need. So while scratch is really good to feed them for a treat, you do not want to feed scratch as the only feed that you're feeding your birds. Likewise, with chicken treats and any type of supplements that are out there, you want to limit these treats to under 10% of your bird's diet. If you start feeding them more than 10%, it's just like us eating candy bars compared to going home and eating your broccoli. Of course, we want the candy bars, right? Everybody loves to eat all the candy bars and the ice cream, but we may not be getting all the nutrients that we need. So limiting those treats, those scratch, any type of thing that you're throwing out, your watermelon. These are some really cool summer treats that they're giving. Although if I was giving summer treats, I would recommend not giving corn. Corn is a high carbohydrate and it creates heat when the birds are digesting the corn. So when it's 100 degrees outside, corn's not the best thing to feed them, but some good old watermelon, some cucumbers that are in here. These are great. Mealworms are a really big thing out there right now that they're marketing for backyard poultry. Mealworms are great. They're high in protein. But again, your birds are going to want to eat a ton of mealworms, and then they may not be eating their complete feed. So we hear a lot of people that are talking about, well, I started feeding them all these extra proteins so that they'd lay better, and they're just not laying. Well, it may be because of their nutritional requirements. They're not getting what they need because they're filling up on the goodies like those candy bars and ice cream. There's a big conversation out there about when you need to feed grit to your birds. If your birds are kept on dirt, if they are able to get out and get to any type of little pebbles or anything that they can pick up, they do not need to have grit added to their diets. Chicks, if they are fed strictly crumbles, which is that chick starter, They do not need grit. In fact, you are going to cause more problems by adding grit into their diets than you would by leaving it out. If your birds are kept pinned up, if you keep them in any type of coop that has a concrete bottom or a wire bottom on them, they are going to need some grit, especially if you are feeding any type of scratch or any of those supplements. A regular complete poultry feed that is a crumble or a pellet is digestible enough that they do not need to have grit added to them. This is kind of a cool picture. I hope I'm not grossing anybody out by this, but this is a cool picture of a bird's digestive system. And a bird has something called a crop that is up here. And this crop kind of acts as a storage pouch. So when they're eating food, it comes down into this crop. It starts slowly going down here into what's called the gizzard. A chicken really doesn't have a stomach like we do. So the food passes through the crop, it goes into the gizzard. The gizzard is where the food is actually ground up. So this is where grit is important to have if the birds are out running around and are getting any type of scratch in those seeds. They need to be able to grind that using that grit or those little stones. If you guys are in 4-H, this is a really cool thing to study is how chickens actually digest their food, because it's ground up here and then it goes ahead and passes on down through the intestines where everything is actually absorbed. So again, not going to get into a whole lot of detail on everything, but this is why grit and feeding a complete feed comes back into play, is we do want our chickens to be able to digest their food in a proper manner. Hopefully by now everybody knows that eggshells are made of approximately 94% calcium carbonate, which is basically oyster shell. That's all calcium. So adding calcium via oyster shell to your laying hen's diet can be very important to help those help those chickens produce nice, strong eggshells. Adding oyster shell into your chicken's diet does not necessarily make them lay more eggs. That's kind of a common myth. Oh, they need to have oyster shell in order to lay eggs. What it does help is it does help provide those higher levels of calcium that help those eggshells be nice and strong. So when they're coming out of the chicken, they're not breaking all over. It's harder for the chickens to step on them and break them. Therefore, you'll have more eggs to have for your breakfast, or if you're selling them to your neighbors or doing an egg production project, you'll have more eggs to write down in your manuals. So if you have a flock of just laying hens, having oyster shell available to them is a good thing, but you do need to keep in mind that if you're feeding that complete feed, you may not need to add extra calcium to them. This is something I would talk to your feed store about. I would look at your feeding labels so that you can see what that level of calcium is in there. But if you are seeing softer shelled eggs, thinner shelled eggs, adding some calcium by oyster shell is a good thing for your birds. One of the big things that's happening right now is we're basically telling you, do not let your birds out of their pens. Do not let them free range. And we're going to tell you the reason why for that here in just a minute. But if you are letting your birds out, if they are able to roam around, please be aware of any toxic plants around your property. There are several different plants that grow in Colorado, especially that can be poisonous. A lot of our garden plants can be poisonous to our chickens. Now, usually they're smart enough to stay away from those toxic plants. Animals can tend to have that kind of inner sense of what's good for them and bad for them. So usually they'll stay away from some of these things. But sometimes we inadvertently add some of those poisonous or toxic plants around our pens. So here's just a list of some things that you don't want to feed to your birds. One of the things I'll definitely point out here is this tomato or eggplant leaves. This is not talking about regular tomatoes. You can still give them tomatoes. In fact, chickens love tomatoes, but the leaves themselves do have some toxins in them that can kill your birds. So try to make sure that if you're planting tomato plants or if your chickens are out running around through the garden, that they can't get to these type of leaves. Again, most generally, your birds are not going to try to eat something that is toxic to them, But if that is the only type of greens that they have around their pens, they're going to be more likely to get a hold of something or want to eat these tomato leaves than what they would if there was other types of greenery around them. So I just said a minute ago that we're going to advise you not to let your birds run around outside. And this is why. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about biosecurity. Some of you guys might have heard recently about the avian influenza outbreaks or the bird flu outbreaks that are happening back east. There are a ton of different types of diseases or infections that birds can get. These are just a few. Merrick's disease, salmonella. We all should know about salmonella. Wash your hands really good after you've been handling your chicks. Because salmonella can make you really, really sick. Viral Newcastle disease, this is something that shut down California over the past several years. Coccidiosis, we talked about that a little bit with why we want to feed medicated feed. Respiratory infections, all of these things come back to biosecurity. I think everybody has learned a little bit more about biosecurity in the last couple of years with the corona pandemic that we've had, but our birds can get sick too. So we want to try to do our very best to make sure that our birds aren't getting sick. Some of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're getting your birds. If you are obtaining new birds, like we talked about with those adult birds, keep them away from the rest of your flock. If there is something those birds have, if they've got an upper respiratory infection, if they've got mites, if they've been across the country and you've got them shipped in, by quarantining those birds for that 30 days, if there's anything that they've got, you're normally going to see the signs of those infections or those diseases or those parasites within that 30 days. And by not introducing them to the rest of your flock, you're going to help prevent all of your birds from ending up with some sort of a disease or sickness or even something like mites. Your birds, the number one way that a lot of these different infections is carried is through wild birds, game birds, waterfowl. Waterfowl is a huge carrier of some of these diseases. They don't tend to get sick and die from it like our other birds do. So they bring it in, they're flying over in our different flyways right now. They're pooping all over everything. And then our birds go out and get in it and they're bringing it back. And now all of a sudden we've got a bunch of sick birds. So this is why we're saying that you should be keeping your outdoor birds confined to some sort of an area. Some sort of screened area, whether that be using some hardware cloth, whether that be the chicken wire, something to keep those extra wild birds out. The rodents, the insects, they can all carry all of those different diseases around to your birds. Making sure that you're getting birds from a reputable disease-free source. So if you are buying from a hatchery, hopefully those chicks have been coming from some place that has an NPIP certification, which is the National Poultry Improvement Program. And those birds are coming in saying, hey, we are good, we are healthy, we don't have any type of sicknesses. If you're obtaining birds from a breeder, you decided you wanted some really good show birds and you went to an individual breeder, make sure that you're talking to them about the different types of diseases that are out there. Make sure that they haven't seen any symptoms or signs of diseases in their birds before you take them home. Making sure that your feed is nice and clean, that you're not leaving it out in the rain, you're not leaving it outside where all the wild birds are getting into it. And one of the biggest things is making sure that you're giving your birds that nice, clean, fresh water all the time. Clean out those feeders and waterers. A couple of years ago, I had a scare where I had a bunch of birds that had passed away. Walked out one morning, had like 5 birds that were dead in my barn, couldn't figure out what was going on. It happened to be the birds that I had been letting out. They had actually gotten into our neighbor's creek where there had been some wild birds that had obviously had some sort of a bacterial infection. And after doing some necropsies on them and sending the birds in to the CSU veterinary hospital, I found out that it was a simple bacterial infection, and they were getting it because they were in water that these wild birds had been in. So these wild birds coming into your coops or getting into your pens and just simply drinking could be spreading those diseases. So again, trying to keep those other animals out of your bird pens, keeping them out of your waters, keeping that food and water clean is going to help cut down on the amount of diseases and sicknesses that your birds could have. The other thing that you really want to be careful of is a lot of our poultry diseases can be carried around on feces, basically your bird poop that you've walked through and carried home or carried into somebody else's pen. So restricting how many people you have coming and going from your premise right now is a really good idea. You don't know what kind of birds they've come into contact at home, if they've been out walking around the park. I don't know how many of you guys have tons of Canadian geese around your park, but there's another one of those carriers of some of those sicknesses that we don't want to carry home to our birds. So just be aware that you don't want to have a whole bunch of people come in to see your birds all the time. There are some ways to keep some of those birds and some of those extra animals out. Feeders such as this one, which the chickens get up on and it opens the lid. It takes a certain amount of weight for them to be able to open this. Your mice, your extra wild birds, they can't necessarily get into the food. Most generally, once the food source is gone, a lot of the wild birds will go looking for the food source somewhere else. By putting poultry netting, this is actually what I'm getting ready to put over my barn right now, including a small mesh poultry netting so that the birds can't get through here to get into the feed is going to reduce. It is not going to keep them from doing anything, because I guarantee you're still going to have birds sitting up here that are still going to poop down onto your pens. Then your chickens walk through the poop and then they can still get sick. Keeping a nice tin roof over the top with some good small mesh. This is probably the best setup in order to help with keeping some of those wild birds out of your pens, which is then going to reduce your incidence of infection. So just a real quick recap on avian influenza. Avian influenza is what's happening right now back east. We also call it HPAI, which is highly pathogenic avian influenza. There's also something called a medium pathogenic and a low pathogenic. So high pathogenic basically means that it is spreading quickly. It has a higher presence of creating an infection in your birds. And here's kind of some history on what's been going on. It was first detected in the very beginning of January in South Carolina. The reporting parties, which basically goes back to the USDA, they will only list when it is first detected in a state. So by this count, this doesn't mean that these are the only ones in South Carolina. But why I've added this on here, and I actually didn't add one that what came in this morning. There was also a case in Michigan that was detected this morning. But you can see how quickly this spread to different states. South Carolina, Indiana, Virginia, Kentucky, New York, Maine, Delaware. This spreads very quickly. And this time of year, we are very concerned about the spread of avian influenza because the birds are starting to migrate. So these huge flocks of Canadian geese, the huge flocks of snow geese, all these other birds start moving. I don't know how many of you have starlings. If you're in Colorado, I can guarantee you've been fighting starlings recently. These huge flocks of birds that travel in what they call flyways, which is from clear down in Mexico, going clear up to Canada as they migrate. And every single one of these types of birds can carry these types of diseases, whether they're bacterial, whether it's avian influenza, whether it's mites. Wild birds are big carriers of the mites that we don't like to see on our birds, all those creepy crawlies that gross you out. So trying to keep these type of birds out of your barn is some of the best things that you can possibly do to keep your birds healthy. Just some quick signs of avian influenza. Basically, if you have birds that die for no reason and several birds that die for no reason, you should possibly be concerned about avian influenza. Now, that doesn't mean it is avian influenza. There are a ton of different poultry diseases out there, such as Newcastle disease, that have the same types of signs as avian influenza. Hopefully, keeping our fingers crossed, we don't have to deal with avian influenza in Colorado. I do not know of the last time that we did have avian influenza in Colorado. There was a huge outbreak of low pathogenic avian influenza in 2019 that was on both coasts, both in California and back east. But hopefully we're not going to have to deal with this if everybody keeps their birds all locked up and keeps them all nice and healthy and keeps all those starlings and waterfowl away from them. we're not going to get this. The reason we don't want to get this is it is a huge hit to poultry production. Avian influenza is what they call a reportable disease, which means that it goes into our state veterinarian's office. If your birds have avian influenza, they do depopulate, which means that they will euthanize all of the birds that you have on your premise. So you do not want to get avian influenza. Take every type of precaution that you possibly can to keep avian influenza out of your flocks. The good thing about avian influenza is it is not being seen transferred to humans. Overseas it does. There's some different strains out there that has a little bit more of a human interaction, but so far in the United States, we're not seeing it being transferred to humans, which is great. But again, we don't want to kill all of our birds. We don't want to walk out into the barn and have all your birds dead. So take those precautions to make sure that you're doing your best, not only for avian influenza, but for simple things like upper respiratory infections. Most upper respiratory infections in birds are not curable. They are something that the symptoms may come and go, but they're always going to carry those viruses. So we want to try to keep our birds as healthy as we possibly can. So I have talked pretty consistent now for almost 55 minutes, very quickly. So I know that was a very brief overview of a whole lot of topics that we had, but I would like to give anybody the time that they have to ask some questions, whether you want to come online, whether you want to put some questions in the chat box. I did have a couple of questions that were submitted ahead of time, so I want to go ahead and give you some answers on those. One of the questions that I had is, does it matter what type of chickens we use for the showbird project? So my answer to that is technically no, it doesn't matter. You can get whatever type of bird you want. The thing I would keep in mind is the difference between your hatchery birds and your exhibition birds. Your exhibition quality birds are always going to show better at a county fair or a poultry show than what your feed store birds are. And then, can we buy them at the local feed store? Hopefully I answered that one. Yes, you can buy them at your local feed store, whether you're doing fancy little birds, little bantams. Something to keep in mind is you may not be able to get your breed that you want in an exhibition quality bird, because if you live in Colorado and the only place that you can find a breeder is in Florida, it may not be cost effective for you to get those birds in. So you may have to settle for getting the little bantams that you want through one of your local feed stores, through a hatchery, and it may not be quite the quality that you're looking for. But again, if it's what you want, I've always said that I'd rather see a kid that has the birds that they want, because they're going to take better care of them and they're going to like their projects way better than if they just have to settle for something that they weren't really looking for. Most 4-H members, hopefully most of you guys that are on already know about record books. Different states have different types of 4-H record books. In Colorado, you can get your record book off of the Colorado State 4-H website. And that is the record book that you'll use. You need to make sure that you're getting either your junior, your intermediate, or your senior record book, and print those off. And if you have questions about your record book, those are ones that you can go to your local extension agent, your local poultry project leader, and they'll be able to help you through those individual record books. Let's see, what was my other questions that were submitted? How young do showbirds need to be? And can they be over a year? So yes, they can definitely be over a year. In fact, my kids showed birds clear up until some of their little call ducks were almost 10 years old before we retired them out of the show flocks. What I would be more concerned about is how young your birds are when they go to fair. If a chick isn't fully feathered out, don't take it to the county fair. If it's itty bitty, tiny, still needing any type of heat, don't take it to the county fair. The more mature your birds are by the time that they go to a show, the better they are going to show. And again, when you go to your shows, you're going to be entering them either as a pullet or as a hen or as a cock or a cockerel, depending on whether they're over or under a year old. Okay, I see some in the chat. So what level of calcium should we look for in your complete feeds? So it's really going to depend on what breed you're really raising. If you're raising something like Leghorns that have a very high production rate of eggs, you're probably going to want a little bit higher of a calcium. I'm not a nutritional specialist, so I can't give you the exact level that you should be looking for. But if I was worried about calcium levels in my complete feed, I would be making sure that I was buying a good layer ration and not just a regular old, scratch or just a regular old feed that's out there. If you talk to any of your local feed stores, any of your local feed dealers, they're going to be able to give you an exact on those nutritional labels. And we have chickens in our garage. They're very dusty. Chickens are dusty. They have something called dander. Those feathers are constantly growing. And so the cuticle that comes off of their feathers is what's creating that dander and creating that dust. Do we have to have some sort of fluff, or can they just be on wood or concrete? They're going to be happier if they have something to scratch around in. Is there a reason to have it? Not necessarily, but I would tell you that keeping them on something more than just being on wood or concrete is probably going to help cut down on that dander, because that dander is going to attach to things such as your pine shavings or whatever type of bedding that you have in there. And the chickens do like to scratch up and stuff. They like to fluff. They like to get in and dust themselves with whatever you've got in there. So chickens by nature tend to just be kind of dusty because of that dander on their feathers. And what do you look for on a nutrition label to know if the diet is complete? So most of your feeds are going to tell you right on the label that there are a complete feed. A layer feed is going to have a complete nutrition for the individual laying birds. Different birds in different stages of growth have different nutritional requirements. So a chick feeding a chick starter and then possibly moving them over into a grower. And then when you get up into a layer, or you can get up into those flock raisers that have a little bit higher protein for the different species that you may have mixed together, such as turkeys and ducks maybe mixed in with your chickens. Those different types of feeds are what we call complete. If you're just going out and getting just a grain, that's what I would say would not be a complete feed. So if it is a mixed feed, you could say it was a complete feed. I hope that was kind of a roundabout answer on a nutritional label. And then, do medicated feeds help with other diseases? They can. So most of your chick feeds, and you're only going to find a medicated feed in a chick starter. You're not going to find it in a layer or in a flock raiser type feed. So the medicated feed that you feed to chicks has something called amprolium in it, which is a type of an antibiotic that helps to combat mainly coccidiosis, because that's what we normally see in chicks. Can it help with respiratory diseases? Yes, it can help with the symptoms of the respiratory diseases. But again, most respiratory diseases in poultry are not curable. They're ones that they're going to carry for the rest of their lives. And you'll see symptoms of those respiratory diseases when the animals are stressed. So don't count on a medicated feed to take care of other diseases. It will help you to mask the symptoms or to help them feel better. It's kind of like us taking cough syrup. Is it going to get rid of the cold? No, it's got to kind of run its course, but it is going to make us feel better.